This Insight session is brought to you by the Banking and Finance Guild. The Banking and Finance Guild is a professional learning and development platform for banking, finance, and fintech professionals. Now, I'm sure you've experienced this once in your career. You apply for a role in banking, you read the job description and think, yes, I can do this. I have what it takes to do this role really well. You meet the criteria, you might even exceed it, and then nothing. Radio silence. No phone calls from the recruitment team or hiring manager. I'm sure that sounds very familiar to many of you when hiring teams don't even bother coming back to you after you put in the effort to apply for the role. No interview and no feedback. Or maybe the opposite happens. Someone gets hired and you're left thinking, I genuinely don't understand how that person got the role. If either of those situations sounds familiar, you're not imagining things, and it's not because you're missing something obvious. It's because banks don't hire the way people think they do. In this Insight session, I want to explain how hiring actually works inside banks and fintech. Not the official version, not the HR brochure version, not the polished bank or fintech company version. Once you understand this, a lot of things suddenly click. Why some people move faster than others, why learning doesn't always translate into opportunity, and why doing all the right things can still lead to radio silence. This isn't theory. This is how decisions get made in practice, and I want to be really clear. This strategy works. It's how I've helped countless friends and colleagues get a step up in their careers, and I want this to work for you too. Let's start with the most important thing to understand. Hiring inside a bank or a fintech company is not one decision. It's a chain of filters, and at each stage, different people are trying to avoid different risks. The first filter is usually HR or human resources. HR's job isn't to find the best banker or fintech professional in the country. Their job is to reduce noise. They are the front doors before you even get into a shortlist of candidates for a hiring manager to review. So HR are scanning applications and asking, does this person clearly fit the role? Is their background easy to understand? Do they look bank or fintech relevant? And are there any obvious red flags? If your CV feels fragmented, confusing, or hard to interpret, it doesn't get decoded, it gets skipped. That's not personal. It's volume. HR are having to go through sometimes hundreds of CVs to create a shortlist. If you haven't invested the time in creating a compelling, polished CV and clearly articulating why you are an excellent fit for the role, then you can't expect a miracle. Then the hiring manager steps in, and this is where things change. Hiring managers aren't just thinking, can this person do the job? They're thinking, would I feel comfortable putting this person in front of stakeholders? Can I and my broader team work alongside this person? And are they a behavioral and cultural fit? Could I defend this hire in 6 months' time? Will this person operate safely in a regulated environment, such as banking? And am I taking an unnecessary risk? Banks are conservative institutions. Nobody wants to be remembered as the person who made a risky hire. They don't want to be the person that hires someone who has exited out of the organization 3 months, 6 months, 12 months later because of poor performance, bad behavior, or even worse, things like dishonesty, fraud, or theft, which is why banks and fintech companies don't just hire skills. They hire signals that say this person is credible. This person understands how banks work, and this person won't cause surprises. This means recognized credentials, as in has the candidate spent time investing in their continual learning and has achieved verifiable certifications in relevant banking, finance, and fintech domains. Familiar career paths. Now, a red flag is always going to be where a candidate has jumped roles or organizations. Of course, sometimes roles or organizations don't work out, but if there's a pattern of working in roles for 6 months or organizations for 6 months before moving on, that's a warning sign. The candidate is unwilling to stick it out in roles and deal with challenges, or alternatively, their employers are finding out they're just not capable. Known institutions and internal referrals. These are all important and carry far more weight than people realize, not because they guarantee competence, but because they reduce uncertainty. There are two realities people don't like to talk about. The first is referrals. Inside banks and fintech, referrals matter a lot. If someone trusted says, I've worked with this person, they're solid, that immediately lowers perceived risk. It doesn't mean the person is perfect. It just means that they're known. And in banking and fintech, known is safer than unknown. The second reality is internal mobility. Banks often try to fill roles internally first, especially at junior and mid-level. Why? Because internal candidates already understand the systems, already understand the culture, and ramp up faster, as well as usually costing less. So sometimes you can apply externally and you're competing with someone else who already does part of the role, already has relationships within that organization, or is already on a succession plan. And you're never told that, which is why you can do everything right as an external candidate and still not progress. It's tough, but welcome to the real world. Once you understand that banks hire to reduce uncertainty, the unspoken rules start to make sense. These are never written down. Nobody tells you these explicitly, but they quietly shape outcomes. So let me share with you 5 unspoken rules. Credentials, structure, fit over raw competence, cross-domain awareness, and specialists. Let me break this down for you. First off, titles and credentials matter more than people admit. Banks and fintech are status-aware environments. A known credential or brand doesn't just signal knowledge, it signals safety. It gives hiring managers cover. If a hire works out, great. If it doesn't, they can still say, on paper, this hire made sense. When I talk about credentials, I'm talking about previous work history. So you've worked in reputable organizations, and I'm also talking about certifications and qualifications that are reputable too. Second, banks prefer structured capability over scattered learning. Someone with a clear development path often beats someone with lots of disconnected learning. Not because the person isn't smart, but because banks struggle to interpret fragmented profiles. They ask, what is this person actually good at? What role identity are they building? And where's the depth? In the minds of hiring managers, they will expect you to have done the hard yards. You've worked in relevant roles. You've gradually built up your knowledge and skills. If you're someone who started out as a graduate at a bank and within 2 years you're applying for executive roles, unless you're a unicorn, they won't look on this too favorably. Same goes with learning. Have you followed a progressive learning path where you've taken courses and completed certificates incrementally and then looked for opportunities to apply those skills and knowledge learned to your work and roles? Third, fit often beats raw competence. Banks care deeply about how people operate. Can you work calmly? Can you communicate clearly? Can you operate in a controlled environment? And can you collaborate across functions? A slightly less skilled candidate who feels stable and bank ready often beats a more talented candidate who feels unpredictable. Fourth, cross-domain awareness is a quiet advantage. Banks love specialists, but they really love specialists who understand the broader banking and fintech ecosystem. If you understand how risk interacts with product, operations affects customer experience, technology shapes delivery, and payments connects everything, you start to look more senior than your title. And finally, specialists usually beat generalists. In most bank roles, depth matters. Generalists thrive in strategy and leadership tracks. There's definitely an opportunity for generalists, but in risk, operations, technology, product management, cybersecurity, and payments, for example, banks and fintech want clear, role-aligned capability. If you're applying for credit risk modeling roles, but your experience has been as a generalist, leading staff in a bank branch, then that's not going to work. The mistake people make is trying to be everything at once. Banks don't hire potential identities. They hire clear ones. Now let's talk about what banks and fintech consistently value, regardless of roles. Firstly, you are a guardian of the institution. This means you are risk literate. Risk literacy isn't about jargon. It's about judgment. It's about naturally asking, what could go wrong here? How do we control it? And how do we evidence the control? Candidates who think this way feel safe to banks. It means you understand governance and controls awareness. You understand that banks and fintech want controlled outcomes. And it means you understand incident response thinking. You know how to assess impact, escalate, communicate, and learn from mistakes, whether they are small mistakes or large. This mindset is gold in banking and fintech. Second, you understand the machine and its purpose. This means you understand how a bank or fintech works, the decisions that get made, how governance works, and the ecosystem of operations within a bank. And you also understand customer life cycles. You understand the impact of your work, your team's work on customers, from onboarding through to servicing customers, complaints, and retention. And then last of all, you are a catalyst for delivery. You understand how payments work, how digital works, This knowledge is universally valued no matter where you work in banking or fintech. And then it's about the actual execution side, how to work effectively in cross-functional teams and workplaces. Are you able to work across product, technology, operations, risk, and compliance? And are you seen as someone who can actually get things done? And then your awareness and ability to harness the advantages and considerations of both agile and waterfall delivery. Do you really understand how delivery works in practice? In other words, you aren't just a theorist. Agile, waterfall, these are tools. But what matters is your ability to apply them to real-world banking and fintech contexts. Now let's talk about the silent killers. First, course collector energy. Lots of learning with no clear direction can actually hurt. Banks don't hire curiosity, they hire capability. Second, too many irrelevant certifications. Not all credentials are equal. Noise can dilute signal. Third, no coherent story. If your resume doesn't quickly explain who you are, what you do, and where you're heading, it's very hard for a bank or a fintech company to say yes. Fourth, no bank context. Even technical roles need banking or fintech awareness. If your application ignores risks, controls, or customer impact, that's a concern. And fifth, buzzwords without evidence. Banks and fintech companies are unimpressed by hype. They want outcomes, decisions, and evidence. Let me give you a few real-world examples. Firstly, the storyteller versus the collector. Two candidates, same experience. One can clearly explain how their learning supports a role in digital banking delivery or retail banking, lending, operations. The other lists lots of skills but can't explain how they connect. The first candidate gets hired. The second example is the theorist versus the practitioner. A candidate knows theory brilliantly, but struggles to explain how they'd handle a real incident. They can't translate the theory into action. All they can say is, I'd fix the issue quickly, but what that means in terms of specific steps is obscure. They lose to someone who thinks in terms of impact, escalation, and control. Someone who can translate the theory into practical, relatable, and best practice action. And the last example is the unknown versus the known. An internal candidate competes with an external one for a role. The internal hire wins, not because they're better, but because they're known. These aren't edge cases. They're everyday decisions that happen continually when it comes to hiring. Here's the key insight to leave you with. Learning is not capability. Capability is not credibility. Banks and fintech hire credibility because credibility reduces uncertainty. So my message to you is invest the time learning, but make sure you are translating that learning into practical capability. How do you demonstrate practical capability? Through relevant experience, time spent doing the work, working in solid roles with reputable organizations. If you're investing in learning, the real unlock here is structure and signaling. This means having a plan. What should you learn? What capabilities do you want to demonstrate? And then finding the right courses along with the right roles and organizations to apply that learning. And remember, learning isn't just about what you study through a course. Plenty of times it's what you learn on the job or from experts in banking and fintech that really counts. Before you go, let me share one final thought. Everything we've covered off in this insight session explains how banks and fintech really think about hiring. But for many professionals, the harder question is this: how do I clearly signal what I'm capable of in a way that banks and fintech actually recognize and trust? That question is what led to the creation of the Banking and Finance Guild. The Guild is a professional learning and certification platform designed to help banking, finance, and fintech professionals translate learning into clear, role-aligned capability. Right now, the Guild is live with its first certification pathway, the Digital Banking Specialist. What's important to understand is this certification isn't about collecting another badge. It's built around the competencies that banks and fintechs consistently value and reward in hiring decisions, aligned to what leading institutions around the world expect from their people. By completing the pathway, professionals can confidently demonstrate capability across areas such as how modern digital banking models actually operate, how payments, channels, and customer journeys fit together, how risk controls and cybersecurity shape day-to-day decision-making, how banking systems and platforms work in practice, how fraud risk is identified, managed, and governed, and how delivery really happens across product, technology, operations, and risk. In other words, it helps turn the learning you may have already completed into something coherent, credible, and legible to hiring managers. The Digital Banking Specialist is the first pathway, and the Banking and Finance Guild are actively developing additional role-based certifications across retail banking, corporate banking, payments, risk and compliance, operations, and financial crime. If you'd like to explore what's currently available, see how your completed Udemy or other learning platform courses map into the certification pathway, or register your interest in upcoming certifications, you can visit bankingfinanceguild.org. You'll also find the link below. I've also included a link below to download a short set of notes from this Insights session, a one-page summary you can keep as a reference. Thanks again for watching. I hope this insight helps you approach your next career move with more clarity, confidence, and perspective.